Hey class, so today we are going to do some reading comprehension, and writing, and we're going to do that using a short story titled The Snake King. And that story can be found in this book here, and it's called Listen Children, an anthology of Black literature. This is one of my favorite books, and I've probably read this book a couple of times when I was in elementary. So we're going to do a couple of things with this book. So it's a really cool short story. What I want you to do right now is take out 2 pieces of paper and 1 pencil, and then I need you to copy down the organizer that we're going to use today. So let me put it up here for you guys. It looks just like this. Go ahead, and I'm going to give you guys about a minute to get everything written down. All right, so that should have been enough time for you to get the graphic organizer written down. Now, as I'm reading, I want you to make sure that you're using your listening ears and not your mouth, all right? Now, as I am reading to you, make sure that you're paying attention. I don't need you trying to fill out the graphic organizer while we're reading. We'll have time for that, and we'll do it together after I get finished reading the story. And I'm going to make sure that the video shows the words on the page, so that way you can follow along with my voice as well. So that way, if you hear or see any words you're not familiar with, you can see them, and then you learn a new word. So let's get started. The Snake King, retold by Kathleen Arnott. Timber had some friends who used to go into the forest every day to cut wood and bring it to sell in the market. Sometimes he went with them, for he was a splendid tree climber and knew where the best firewood was to be found. He would hack the branches off with his cutlass and throw them to the ground in a way of all lads. He would sometimes boast, "See how much wood I have collected? I work much faster than you, my friends. Why don't you hurry more?" Timber's friends often became angry with him, although they had to admit to themselves that he was much stronger and faster worker than they were. One day, after Timber had gathered a particularly large bundle of wood, he lay down under a tree to rest and chided his companions good-naturedly because he had already collected as much by himself as they had all together. As he lay there, he began to idly tap the ground with the stone, beating it like a drum. Suddenly, he sat up, tapped again, and called his friends to come. "Listen," he said, "this ground is hollow." Sure enough, as the lads stopped talking and listened to Timber tapping with his stone, they heard the hollow sound that showed there was a cavity below. "Let us dig to see what we find," suggested one of them, and they set to work at once, digging with their cutlasses. After some time, they discovered a large hole in the ground, which was full of wild bees' honey. They dipped their fingers in the honey and sucked them clean. It was delicious. "What a find," said one of the lads. "Now we need not cut firewood to sell, for we can take calabashes of honey to the market and sell those instead." Timber agreed. But whereas he had never asked for any part of the money they made from selling firewood, now he told them he must have a share of what was given them for the honey. At first the boys refused, saying he had enough riches in his compound already. But Timber, who wanted the money to give to his parents, insisted, and at last his companions agreed. Day after day the boys dipped their calabashes in the pit, then took the honey to market, where they found plenty of eager customers. They carefully concealed the pit by covering it with leafy branches and moss each time they left it. so that none of the people who lived nearby knew where the honey came from. The pit was surprisingly deep. As the level of the honey dropped, they had to tie a rope around the waist of one of the boys and let him down to fill the calabashes. Then they all hauled together to pull him up. One morning, when it was almost empty, Timba was lowered into the hole. He filled the calabashes and sent them up to his companions at the end of the rope. In another day or two, we shall have to go back to our wood cutting, for there is scarcely any honey left now, Timba called. The lads looked at one another, remembering how Timba had taunted them for being slower than he was. Then one of them whispered, "Let us leave him there. We can manage our wood cutting without him, and nobody will find him in this pit." "I'm ready," shouted Timba. "Pull me up." There was no answer. Without a word, the boys replaced the branches in moss and tiptoed away from the edge of the pit, gradually leaving Timba's cries behind them in the forest. "What shall we say to Timba's mother?" asked one of the boys as they made their way along the bush path which led to the village. "We must tell her that a lion leaped upon him and dragged him away before we could save him," replied another. So the callous boys told Timba's mother this lie, and she believed them since she had no reason to do otherwise, for everyone knew that hungry lions would seize a man. She wept and mourned for days, while her daughters and her little adopted son did their best to comfort her. Now, when Timba had called to his friends a dozen more times, he began to suspect that a trick was being played on him. "They are sure to come back before sundown," he said to himself, "so I will sleep until then." Great was his surprise when he awoke to find that it was night and his companions had not returned. There was no way out of the pit for the boys. There was no way out of the pit, for the sides were steep and slippery, and the boys had taken the ropes away with them. Timba ate some honey, for there was still a little left in the pit, and then for the rest of the night he sat thinking how he could escape. By now, he was certain that the boys had left him there on purpose, and he guessed that it was chiefly because they were jealous of him that they had been so unkind. For 3 days he struggled to make steps up the side of the pit, but it was quite impossible without tools of any kind, and he began to despair. Then the next day he saw a scorpion creep out of the wall, and when he had killed it, he said, "Where did that creature come from? It could not have lived in the soil, so there must be some kind of passage along which it crawled." Scraping furiously with his hands at the spot where the scorpion had first appeared, Timba soon uncovered what seemed to be a narrow passage. After a few hours' work, he found that it was indeed a way out of the pit, although where the passage would lead him he could not tell. He began to crawl along on his hands and knees, but soon the tunnel grew bigger, and he was able to stand and walk upright. Suddenly he gave out a cry of joy, for at the far end he could see a gleam of light, and he knew he would be soon out of his prison. He began to run, singing with happiness, and at last he found himself in the fresh air and sunshine again, standing in the middle of a wide open space. There were no people to be seen, and he did not recognize the place, but noticing a little path, he decided to follow it. The country seemed strange to him, and he was surprised at the unusual flowers and shrubs he saw growing at the sides of the path. The trees, too, bore different fruits from those he was accustomed to, but still he met no people, so he could not ask where he was. Then, as he turned a corner, he came upon a beautiful house, far bigger than any he had seen near his own village. "Who lives here?" he thought, and going up to the door, he called out greetings in his own language. No one answered, so he put his hand on the door to open it and noticed that it was made of gold. I need you guys to think about what's going to happen next. Put a bubble in your brain and let's see if your prediction is correct. "A golden door," he exclaimed. What rich person lives here? Looking closer, he saw that the door was fastened by a golden latch in which was fixed a silver peg, and in no time at all, Timba had opened the door and stepped inside. Never had he seen such a sight before. He found himself in a large reception room with scores of beautifully carved chairs and stools standing against the walls. At the far end of the room was one very large chair made of shining gold and studded with pearls and precious stones. It made Timba gasp to look at them. "Where can this be?" he said to himself, "and who lives here in such splendor?" There was nobody to answer his questions, and although he stood in the center of the reception room for some time, nobody came to ask him what he was doing there. And not a sound could be heard from any part of the big house. At last, Timba, who had not slept well during his uncomfortable nights in the honey pit, could not keep his eyes open any longer. He caught sight of a long, low chair in one corner, and soon he was stretched out upon it and had fallen fast asleep. Some time later, he awoke to hear voices outside, and before he could rouse himself sufficiently to get to his feet, he saw the strangest procession come into the room. First came some big gray snakes dressed as soldiers. Next came some snakes with green and yellow markings on their back. And last of all came one huge snake, gliding along in the most dignified way, dressed in beautiful silk robes with a golden crown on his head. Timba rose to his feet and faced the crowd of snakes, although his heart was beating furiously. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my house?" asked the magnificently dressed snake. "How dare you come into my palace like this without an invitation? Do you not know that I am the king of the snakes?" When Timba heard this, he bowed low and told the king all that had happened to him, since he had gone down in the pit to collect honey. The soldier snakes closed in upon him and wanted to seize him, but the Snake King, looking into Timba's face and believing he had told the truth, said to them, "Leave him alone. He is not an enemy. He shall be my guest." Then the king sent his servants, those snakes which were green and yellow, to fetch food for Timba. They brought him delicious fruits, such as he had never tasted before, and clear, cool water in a silver cup. While he ate, he told the Snake King about his village, his parents, his sisters, and his little adopted brother. He explained that he was afraid his mother would be worrying because he had not returned from the forest. The Snake King was sympathetic. "Spend the night in my palace," he said, "and in the morning my soldiers will escort you to the borders of your own country. You would never find your way alone." That night, Timba slept on a soft bed covered with a richly embroidered sleeping cloth in the big reception room. He was awakened by a snake servant bringing him a tray with delicious food on it. And when he had eaten, the Snake King came to see him. "It has been good to have you here," said the king. "Men are enemies of snakes, but you have not tried to harm any of my subjects, and I am grateful to you. I will send you home now, but before you go, will you promise that whatever happens to you will never harm me?" "Of course I will not hurt you in any way," protested Timba. "Why should I, after the kindness you have shown?" "Time will show," said the Snake King solemnly. Then he gave his orders to a group of soldier snakes who led Timba from the palace along the little path he had followed the day before. The journey was a long one. They went over a high hill, down into a deep valley, across a wide river by canoe, and through a dark forest. But at last, Timba began to recognize some of the flowers which grew beside the path as those which bloomed near his own village. And then he knew he was getting back to the kingdom of men again. The snake stopped at a stream. "Cross this water and you will be back in your own land," said the leader. "Follow that stony path by the baobab tree, and it will take you to your home." Timba thanked them courteously, crossed the stream, and soon arrived at the compound where his mother and family lived. "Mother, father," he called in a loud voice as he went through the opening in the fence which surrounded their huts. His mother, who was preparing the supper, dropped everything and ran toward him. My son," she cried. "They told me you had been killed by a lion. How did you escape?" "It was all a mistake," replied Timba, not wishing to give his companions away. "After supper, I will tell you my story." When all Timba's family had greeted him, they sat on the ground to have supper outside their hut in the moonlight. Then Timba told them that he had accidentally fallen into a pit, and they listened wide-eyed to his account of the Snake King and his kingdom. The next day his companions came to him and, falling on their knees, begged for forgiveness, promising that they would never do such a thing again. Timba told them not to worry, since they had been the means of giving him a most exciting adventure, which he then recounted to them. They were amazed and went back to their homes to tell the story to their families, and so that everyone in the village knew that Timba had been the guest of the Snake King. A week or two later, the chief of that part of Africa became ill. Nothing his wise men and doctors could do made him feel any better. And at last one very old, very wise man said to the others, "I have seen this sickness before. Our chief will die unless we can obtain what is probably unobtainable, the heart of the king of the snakes." All the people were in despair, for no one knew where the king of snakes lived. But as the news of what was needed spread around the nearby villages, a friend of Timba's heard it and went running at once to the wise men. "I can tell you who knows where the king of snakes lives," he exclaimed triumphantly. "A boy called Timba visited the place a few weeks ago and came back to our village and told us about it." The wise men were delighted and sent for Timba immediately. But when he heard that they wanted to kill the king of snakes and to use his heart for medicine, he would not tell them the way to the snake's kingdom. Then the wise men called the chief's warriors, and they beat Timba and tied his arms with ropes and forced him to lead the way to the Snake King. Slowly and sadly he took them across the stream, through the forest, over the wide river in a canoe, down through the valley, over the hill, and at last he pointed out the king's palace to them. They dragged and pushed him along in front of them until they met a group of soldier snakes. Then a fierce battle began, and because the warriors were stronger and better armed, they soon drove all the soldier snakes into the bush and forced their way into the palace. The Snake King was waiting on his bejeweled throne. The warriors rushed at him and bound him with ropes and vines. "Forgive me," whispered Timba. "I was forced to show them the way." "I know," replied the Snake King softly, "but never fear. After they have killed me and taken my heart, throw my body in the stream that divides your country from ours, and all will be well." He had just finished speaking when one of the warriors lifted his spear and plunged it into the king's side so that he died at once. Then it was only a matter of moments before the heart had been cut out and placed in a bag around the warrior's neck, and the remains of the Snake King were left lying on the ground at Timba's feet. The warriors departed swiftly, singing and shouting with joy because they now had the medicine that would cure the chief, and they hoped for a big reward. They scarcely seemed to notice that Timba had been left behind, with his arms still bound. After a long struggle, he managed to free himself, and then sadly he picked up the body of his friend, the Snake King, wrapped it in a cloth he found on a chair nearby, and began his long journey home. It was almost dark when he reached the little stream. In the distance, on the other side, he could hear drumming and singing and general rejoicing. So he guessed that the chief had recovered. He paused and tried to remember exactly what the Snake King had said to him. Then he unwrapped the body, stood up, and threw it into the stream, where it sank to the bottom with a loud splash. Timba waited, but nothing seemed to happen. It grew darker, and the grasses behind him rustled, and he could not go home until he knew whether the king of snakes was alive again. "Alas," he said aloud, "what has happened to my friend? Is this the river he told me to throw him into, or have I made a mistake?" "This is the river," said a voice behind him, and out of the darkness, gliding through the grass, came the Snake King. "Thank you. You have brought me back to life," he said. "I shall return to my kingdom now, but never tell anyone in your village that I am alive again, or they will seek me out a second time if their chief becomes ill." "Goodbye. I promise to never speak of it," replied Timba. Then, watching until the Snake King disappeared into the darkness, he crossed the stream and went to his own village, where he joined in the dancing and singing with a light heart, knowing that his friend was alive and safe. All right, guys, so that's the end of the Snake King. So in that short story, we talked about the main character, Timba, meeting the Snake King. So what I want you to do now is take a moment and I want you to fill out your graphic organizer. Go ahead and write in Timba as the character. Go ahead and write in the setting. It was a couple of different settings. And then I also want you to fill in what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then lastly, where it says opinion. Remember, guys, we talked about an opinion. An opinion is how you feel about something. So I want you to let me know, how do you feel about the short story titled The Snake King? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it boring? Was it exciting? Did the story surprise you? Was your prediction correct? And why do you feel that way? So I think The Snake King was blank because blank. So go ahead and pause the video right now and get your graphic organizer filled out. And then once you get it filled out, go ahead and press play for the next part. All right, so let's talk about the story. So in the story, we had a main character, Timba. And then we also had another main character, the Snake King, which we got introduced to in the middle of the story. But we also had Timba's companions that he worked with in the forest. So those are a couple of different characters. I mean, you can go on to say about the chief, and you could also list his mother. Those would be some other characters that you could list for characters. Now, let's talk about the setting. So the setting of the story, it starts off taking place in the forest. And that's where Timba and his friends are cutting the wood. And then they, of course, go into the village to sell the wood in the market. That's another setting. And then the next setting that we get introduced to is the hole in the ground that had the honey. So that's another setting. And then, of course, Timba going through the passageway from the hole to the other country. And that country is where the Snake King resides. And of course, we can list the Snake King's palace as another setting because some of the story does take place there. Well, of course, then we can go on back to Timba's compound where he lives when he goes back to his mother and father. And of course, the forest again in the end of the story. So those are a couple of different places that you could list for your setting. Now let's talk about what happened in the beginning of the story. So in the beginning of the story, Timba and his friends were in the forest cutting wood. And his friends were jealous that he cut it so fast and Timba didn't make it any better because he boasted. He was bragging. So, of course, now we get to the part of the story and Timba finds the cavity, and a cavity is a hole. So if you have a cavity in your mouth, in your tooth, it's a hole in your tooth. So a cavity on the ground is a hole in the ground. And in that hole, they find honey. So, hey, why do we have to chop wood when we can just sell the honey? So now we're going to move on to the middle of the story. In the middle of the story, this is where they decide, hey, we don't need Timba anymore, not for his bragging, his boasting. So let's just leave him there and we'll tell his mom a lie that a lion dragged him away. And so they leave Timba there, and Timba stays there for about 3 days before he crawls through a passageway and he gets to this new country and he meets the Snake King. Now in the Snake King's palace, the Snake King is nice to him because Timba didn't do anything to harm the Snake King or his servants or the people of his land. And he stays there a day or so, and then he goes back to his country. Now when he gets back to his country, he tells his mother and father what happens to him. But guess what? He decided not to tell on his friends. Would you do that? Because I think that I would say, Mom, they left me in a hole. But he didn't. And so now we're going to move on to the end of the story. In the end of the story, the chief of the village is really, really sick. And so word travels around that the chief is really sick, and the old wise men said that he needed the heart of the Snake King, which they knew they wouldn't be able to get to use for medicine. And so word travels, and it gets back to one of Timba's friends, and he's like, hey, I know this guy, and he met the Snake King, so he knows exactly where he lives. But if you remember, he promised that he would cause no harm to the Snake King. So when they come to get Timba, Timba's like, nope, not telling you. I have nothing to do with that. But they beat Timba. So Timba, after being beaten, he shows them the way to the other country, to the Snake King's palace. Well, they get there. There's a fight between the snakes and the men. Because remember, men and snakes are enemies. And then they get to the Snake King, and the Snake King is sitting on his palace. He already knows what's going on, and he goes ahead and gives himself up. So now the soldiers, they kill the Snake King and take his heart. But right before they did that, the Snake King told Timba to get his body and throw it in the river between his country and the Snake King's country. So Timba does this. And guess what happens? The Snake King comes back to life. But he makes Timba promise not to tell anyone that he's still alive. So, I hope that you got all this little chitter chatter that I've just done with you about what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end written down in your graphic organizer. So that should give you some more details about what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end. So now what I need you to do is look at your opinion. Your opinion should be a complete sentence. Your opinion should tell me whether you like this story or didn't like this short story. It should also tell me, was it good? Was it bad? Was it exciting? Was it boring? Was it the happiest story you ever read? Was it the best short story you ever listened to? And then tell me why you feel like that. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, so your graphic organizer should look a little bit like this. I didn't fill in the beginning, middle, end, or my opinion because I didn't want you to copy down what I thought. And then I want you to go ahead and make sure that's finished. And we're going to use this to write the first draft of our book summary about the Snake King. Okay, so on the back of your graphic organizer, we're going to start writing our first rough draft of our book summary. So if you see at the top, I have my name, the date, of course. And then the first sentence is the Snake King is about. This is our topic sentence. What are you going to write that grabs my attention and tells me what the story is about? So go ahead and write your first sentence, your topic sentence. Next, we're going to have detail 1, detail 2, detail 3. For detail 1, 2, and 3, it's not just going to be one sentence. It's going to be a couple of different sentences for each thing. So for detail 1, you're going to write about what happened in the beginning. For detail 2, you're going to write about what happened in the middle. In detail 3, you're going to write about what happened in the end. Lastly, our conclusion sentence is going to be our opinion sentence. We're going to end this book summary with an opinion of what we think about the story. So I gave you a sentence starter. In my opinion, I think this short story was blank because blank. So I'm going to give you a minute to go ahead and get this template written down so that you can begin to fill it in.
Now what I want you to do is take your writing, and I want you to have a parent or older sibling or some other family member or friend to look at your writing and edit it. See if you need some corrections. Make sure that you have punctuation. Make sure that your sentences make sense. And make sure that you have good spacing and spelling. And then we're going to do our last step. We're going to write our final draft so that we can publish it.
Okay, so now you should have an edited rough draft. So what I want you to do now is you're going to make a final draft before you get to type up your work. Did you hear that? I said that you were going to type up your work. So once you get finished writing up your final draft, and it should look a little bit like this, that means that you're going to take it and you're going to write it in a paragraph form. And then you're going to take your final draft and use it to look at as you type it up on the computer. Now, you don't have to be perfect, but I just want you guys to kind of work with typing, something fun to do while we're out. And maybe we'll get to do some more of it when we get back in the classroom. All right, guys, make sure you get that work turned in.